Hi, good evening, everyone. We'll just give it a minute as people start to filter in. You see there are people coming into the virtual room now. Great. Well, good evening, everyone, again, and thank you very much for joining us tonight for this evening's event, 1 year on Global Action on Freedom of Religion or Belief. My name is Susan Coftree, and I'm Director of the Foreign Policy Centre, and I will be your chair for this evening. As many of you will be aware, tonight's event was due to be chaired by Preet Gill, Shadow Secretary of State for International Development, but due to unforeseen circumstances, Preet has to pass on her apologies for this evening. We are, however, delighted that our panelists, who I'll introduce you all momentarily, are able to be with us virtually, and that this has also meant that those who couldn't join us in person in Parliament are actually able to be here with us this evening. The Foreign Policy Centre has organised this discussion together with our long-standing partners, the Aston Centre for Europe at Aston University, to mark the anniversary of the International Ministerial Conference on Freedom of Belief or Religion, which was hosted in London last July. We have 3 speakers who will be reflecting on developments since last year's conference, lessons learned, as well as exploring case studies and providing their view on the approaches needed for the promotion of religious freedom and the protection of religious minorities. Our first speaker this evening will be Dr. Anne Jenison, Senior Lecturer at the Aston Centre for Europe, who will open with some scene setting on the UK, as well as providing insights into international campaigns. She will be followed by her colleague, Dr. Balázs Svent-Iványi, reader at Aston Centre for Europe, who will focus his remarks on Hungary's support for persecuted Christians in the Global South. Last, but by absolutely no means least, we will hear from John Kinahan, Assistant Editor at Forum 18, which is a human rights organisation that promotes religious freedom and monitors and analyses violations of freedom of thought, conscience and belief in Central Asia, Russia, Eastern Europe and the Caucasus region. Before I hand over to Anne to kick us off for tonight's discussion, I'm just going to run through a few quick housekeeping points. Each speaker is actually going to present for 10 to 15 minutes, so there will be an opportunity immediately afterwards to ask questions before we move on to the next presentation. However, there will be time at the end after all the presentations for more questions and discussion, hopefully kind of in the round. To make my job as chair slightly easier, I would ask that you please submit your questions via the Zoom Q&A function. And just lastly to note that we are recording tonight's event, and a copy of which will be posted on FPC's YouTube channel afterwards. So on that note, I'm going to hand over directly to our first speaker, and the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Many thanks, Susan, and welcome everyone to our event. Very happy to have you here and to talk about our research and findings. So I'm sharing my slides with you so that you can follow what I'm actually saying. And then afterwards, I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have, and then turn off the slides, of course, as well. So let me start with our main starting point. So why are we doing this actually tonight? One of the reasons is that we find the UK policy on freedom of religion or belief, or short FoRB, I'm using this acronym in this presentation to make it a bit easier. We see that quite ambivalent. So, for example, the Foreign Secretary commissioned an independent review on FCO support for persecuted Christians, the so-called Truro report, which was published in 2019. And then last year, as mentioned by Susan, there was the Ministerial Conference on FoRB, more or less 1 year ago. And both of them emphasize FoRB for all. So not only for Christians, but for all religious groups and also non-religious beliefs. They also emphasize that it is a human rights that needs to be set in a broader human rights framework. And they stress that intersections with other human rights, such as women's rights, are really important. But then on the other hand, there is the impression that actually UK policy on freedom of religion or belief is driven at the moment by a right-wing agenda, and that it actually singles out Christians, that it promotes a quite one-dimensional perspective on FoRB, and that it sometimes even pits FoRB against other human rights One example would be that after the Ministerial Conference, so retrospectively, there were the mention of women's reproductive rights and rights to sexual health and bodily autonomy were retrospectively removed from a statement on FoRB and gender equality, and we find that quite problematic. So this is our starting point, but our main objective is not to evaluate UK policy or to evaluate what has happened since the Ministerial Conference. Instead, we thought it would be interesting to discuss some lessons learned and conclusions drawn from different case studies and practical experiences for international FoRB promotion beyond the UK. So the main question that we would like to discuss with you tonight is, what can we learn from different approaches and experiences for the international promotion of FoRB and for the protection of the rights of religious minorities? And the case study I am focusing on is research I did on an international campaign to free Asia Bibi. And for those of you who are not familiar with the campaign and with the case, so Asia Noreen, or popularly known as Asia Bibi, is a Christian woman from Pakistan. And she was accused of blasphemy in 2009. So she was a farmhand and got into a quarrel about drinking from water from the same pot with one of her co-workers. And this co-worker then in the argument accused her of blasphemy. And you may know or you may not know that the blasphemy laws in Pakistan are very strict. So they've been existing since colonial times, but particularly since the 1980s and even more the 1990s, they've become more and more stringent. So since the beginning of the 1990s, for example, the imprisonment for life as a penalty for blasphemy or for insulting the prophet was actually removed. It makes the death penalty now more or less mandatory for blasphemy charges. And this is also what happened in this case. So her case was first heard by a local district court in Lahore district, which then sentenced her in 2010, sentenced her to death. Her second lawyer, the first lawyer had to go into hiding because of death threats. The second lawyer then filed an appeal with the Lahore High Court, which however upheld the death penalty in 2014. And the case was then referred to the Pakistan Supreme Court in 2015. Where then Supreme Court judges 3 years later, though, because several judges had recused themselves from the case, acquitted her because there was no evidence. So the local district court in Lahore, for example, did no in-depth investigation, basically just based the verdict on some witnesses and the accusations. And the Supreme Court then argued that there's actually no evidence for actual blasphemy in that case. And Asia Bibi also always had stressed her respect for the religion of Islam and that she had never said anything negative about the religion of the Prophet. In 2018, however, after acquittal due to public protest, there was another judicial review of the verdict, which, however, then in 2019 was upheld, and she was finally released after almost 10 years and now lives in Canada with her family. So, and this case received a lot of international attention from different governments like the US, Canada, the EU itself and some of its member states, but also the Holy See. So Pope Benedict the 16th, for example, in a weekly meeting called for her immediate release in 2010. There were several Christian interest groups from the US, but also different other countries involved. One of them, just as an example, they filed a global petition. The Voice of Martyrs, an organization, filed a global petition in 2011, which gained more than 400,000 signatures, including those of the Pope Benedict and Pope the 16th and Pope Francis. Several international human rights groups were involved, both of a more Christian origin, like the Christian Solidarity Worldwide, and also more secular groups like Amnesty International. And they included the case into their research and their advocacy and some press releases. So we used that case in order to ask what actually explains the success of this international campaign, in order to also get some answers to the more to the broader questions, what can we learn from it? What helps actually to promote the rights of religious minorities? And what we found is that actually this campaign was fraught with a lot of dilemmas. And this brings me to kind of the first lesson, that success actually is relative, right? So we started out with the assumption that the campaign was successful. So she was not executed, she was released, she received asylum in Canada. But we conducted interviews with people involved in the campaign, both from Pakistan, from the US and the EU or Europe. And most of them said that they actually don't consider it to be a success. Because yes, success because she was released, but there are still more than 300 people in prison due to charges of blasphemy in Pakistan. And they don't receive much international attention. And the blasphemy laws still exist, and they just recently have been made even more stringent. And Asia Bibi herself was almost 10 years in prison despite her obvious innocence. In the course of the case, 2 high-ranking politicians were assassinated. There were death threats to her supporters, some other politicians, her lawyers, the judges, which created a really tense situation and made it really difficult to resolve the situation for security reasons. And the case and the issue of blasphemy itself contributed to the emergence of a fundamentalist movement, religious fundamentalist movement in Pakistan that had not existed in that united form before, which is convinced that everybody accused of blasphemy immediately needs to be killed. And this movement regularly instigates mass mobilizations, mob violence, and extrajudicial killings. And nothing of this had been prevented by the international campaign, right? This new movement, for example, makes it even more unlikely now that that the blasphemy laws will be amended in a less regressive way or more liberal way anytime soon. As one of our interlocutors, for example, stressed, touching the blasphemy laws would be political and actual suicide. And nothing of this has been prevented by the international campaign. If something helped and led to her acquittal, it was the bravery of the local lawyers and judges who finally dared to acquit her. So one main lesson, therefore, from at least this specific case is that quiet diplomacy was preferable to public awareness raising. So all the public attention and frenzy, as some of the observers called it, created by some Christian interest groups and turning Asia Bibi in a almost symbol for the international fight against blasphemy laws, provoked mass mobilizations and even more death threats. So whenever word got out or a public declaration was made in support of her, this movement that I mentioned mobilized and went to the streets and called for her death and called for the death of her lawyer and the judges who would dare to acquit her or who did acquit her. And some observers, local observers, argue that this actually delayed the case. So all this public attention, without that public attention, it might have been that she had been acquitted much earlier. Now, of course, quiet diplomacy also carries some risks. It might be so quiet that other actors like parliamentarians, NGOs don't see what diplomats and governments do, and which might provoke even more public attention. So it really needs to be explained and coordinated, and coming to that later. The other risk is that it is used by governments to actually justify inactivity. And there is some anecdotal evidence in our interviews that several governments were actually quite concerned to intervene into that in that case, because they were afraid of that it would backfire, either in terms of attacks on their embassies in Pakistan or also violence from certain groups at home. So there are risks, but nevertheless, quiet diplomacy in that case was much more effective, but preferable to public awareness raising. The other thing that we observed is there was really a disconnect between local efforts and international activities. So basically, there was not one international campaign. There were three, or this campaign had 3 legs, and they pursued different strategies. So there was the more governmental campaign, primarily by diplomatic representatives of different governments, who pursued this quiet diplomacy that I just mentioned. Then there was the more international, primarily but not only Christian civil society, also supported by parliamentarians like from the US Congress and the European Parliament, who pursued more kind of this more typical social movement, human rights activities. They tried to put public pressure on the government. But as I mentioned, that was rather counterproductive in this specific case. And then there were the local supporters of local human rights organizations, a few of them primarily of Christian minority groups, a few journalists and politicians which supported the case from within Pakistan and primarily focused on the judicial process and making sure that this process kind of proceeds and that the lawyer is paid and stuff like that. And there were a few individual contacts between these lags, and in the Q&A I can talk a bit more about that or give you some examples if you're interested. But overall there was quite some disconnect, which probably was problematic, because if there had been more coordination, cooperation, and some of the counterproductive activities maybe could have been avoided. And then third, we saw that there was no intersectional perspective whatsoever in this campaign. Almost none. And this was not an intentional strategy. So one could, of course, argue it was a division of labor, or that those involved in the campaign decided that it was counterproductive to also use other perspectives. But our interviews suggest that it was taken for granted for everybody, because it was a blasphemy case, that the FoRB perspective is the only one that is needed. So what does all this mean for the international FoRB promotion? I think one of the things, first of all, we have to say, of course, this is a very specific case, and I'm not arguing or claiming that this is representative of other cases in the broad field of international FoRB promotion. But I think what we can learn from it is that communication and coordination across borders and levels of governance are key. So local actors usually know best what the best strategy is and how to avoid counterproductive activities. And I think international organizations have to listen to that and have to support them. And a coordinated strategy is also important to avoid counterproductive moves and inactivity, as I explained earlier, so to convince other parts, other legs of the campaign, that quiet diplomacy, for example, in this case, is the most promising strategy, rather than making a lot of noise. And the other thing I think that we can learn for international FoRB promotion is that it might be useful often to consider alternative strategies, particularly in very charged contexts where a Western intervention into anything related to religion may create a lot of opposition and resistance. It might be useful to think about alternative strategies. So in this specific case, it could have been to focus more on the promotion of the rule of law and of the safety for lawyers and judges, so that they can do their work and support and protect and finally acquit victims of blasphemy charges. And the other one is to take intersectionality seriously. So what we can see in Pakistan, for example, is that the blasphemy laws are often used for personal vendettas, political conflicts, and also often to exercise prejudice based on other dynamics and categories like caste, for example, and gender. So what we've seen is that blasphemy charges are often used to remove people from jobs, prevent prosperity and upward social mobility, because they are used against those already marginalized in society, like many poor Christians who are seen as kind of the descendants of Dalits, so-called untouchables. So blasphemy charges are often used, first of all, because there's no real discussion on caste in Pakistan, because it is seen as something of the past. So to preserve the Islamic identity of the state and distance one from the past, it's not really talked about. So blasphemy charges are then used to exercise this prejudice. And we also see there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that the blasphemy accusations are used to silence women and feminist voices, so women who speak out against harassment or who refuse to become friendly with men. who want to report harassment or gender violence, or feminist voices, groups who publicly speak out for women's rights. So the threat of a blasphemy accusation is always there and is often used to silence them. And so we could argue that if we look at blasphemy accusations only from a FoRB perspective, we don't see these discrimination dynamics. And also by focusing on fighting prejudice based on other things than gender, other things than religion, might also help to fight the misuse or abuse of the blasphemy laws. So these are things that should be thought about. But as I said, this is a very specific case, so it is really important to know the local context and listen to local activists in order to coordinate a strategy and also consider alternative strategies to FoRB. Not saying FoRB isn't important, but it may focusing on FoRB directly might not always be the most promising strategy. And I think that is something we can learn as well, at least in the case of religious minorities. Okay, and I'm stopping there now. Many thanks for your attention. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answering them now. If you have any questions later, send me an email. Here's my email address. I'm very happy to also have a conversation later. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. And that was really interesting, particularly about the international campaigns. I have a few questions. I'm just going to use this as an opportunity to remind anyone who wants to ask a question about our presentation now, just to put your questions in the Q&A. Just in terms of the specific campaign in the case of SFPB, I mean, it's interesting because I've worked on international campaigns, having worked previously for a human rights organization on political prisoners, and I think a lot of the issues are actually can be very similar, you know, regardless of the context or the reason for the person's imprisonment. In particularly this case study, how, I mean, clearly it had evolved these three kind of legs of campaigning, as you mentioned. How had that been driven? Was it driven at a local level for people seeking international campaign? I mean, how did she become, or international support, I should say, how did this become such a figurehead case in that particular example?
So there were individual contacts of, for example, a US diplomat. At that time, actually, he was not a diplomat yet, but he became one later with one of the politicians. Shabazz Bhatti was later killed. Another one with Salman Taseer, the governor of Punjab, who was later assassinated. So there were contacts, and they kind of, these local contacts informed them about what had happened. But I think what really drove the international campaign were actually newspaper articles then about the case. And many argued it because it was the first woman and mother who was accused, or not accused, sentenced to death for blasphemy in Pakistan. That created a lot of attention. And then when the Pope, for example, asked for immediate release, that increased the attention even. And then very quickly, international, or primarily American, but not only, civil society organizations came on board. So I don't think it really is the case that local actors asked for international intervention. They asked for help, but I don't think that they intended it becoming so big. The other thing is what I said earlier, these kind of legs of the campaign were so disconnected that, for example, some of the local Pakistani actors we talked to said they weren't aware of any international diplomatic campaign at all. So it was really so quiet, the quiet diplomacy, that they didn't perceive it. And that might be a good thing because it didn't create public attention. So it was more kind of these civil society, religious interest groups that created all the frenzy, as one of our interlocutors called it. That was quite counterproductive then. So yeah, it became kind of almost like a snowball or avalanche.
Yeah, I can understand, and in some ways these things take on a kind of life of of their own when there's so many different perspectives.
Yes, and then probably, sorry, one thing, of course, the assassination of two high-level politicians also created a lot of international attention.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There has been a question that's come in from the chat, but I think it may be better placed, as it's not specifically about your interventions, that we hold off and have that question in the wider discussion. So, and I also have a couple of questions, but I think they might be pertinent to everyone. So actually, perhaps at this point, Balázs, if we turn to you for your presentation.
Yep, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Can hear you and we can see you now.
Video is back as well. I'll quickly
Yeah.
share my screen as well.
Perfect.
Hopefully you can see my PowerPoint.
We can.
Okay, good. So I'm going to be talking a bit about Hungary's freedom of religious belief policy, or at least what Hungary calls as such. Hungary might seem like a bit of an odd choice here, and obviously there's the question of how it links to what Anne has been talking about, but it all linked together, I promise you that. So why Hungary? In the past couple of years, since 2016, basically, Hungary has emerged as a relatively influential player in religious diplomacy, and particularly around freedom of belief for Christians and Christian persecution. And as we'll see, Hungary's policies on what it does in the area actually links quite a lot to what Anne has talked about on some of the directions that the UK's policies are taking, but Hungary is doing it in a bit more extreme form. I'll start off by giving a bit of context. Not everyone may be familiar with everything that's going on in Hungary. Then I'll talk specifically about the origins, the roots of the policy, how this policy developed, and I'll end with a bit of evaluation and thinking critically about this whole thing. So ever since Viktor Orban became Prime Minister of Hungary in 2010, Hungary has featured quite a lot in the international press, and not necessarily for the right reasons. The context that we see here is one of democratic backsliding. Hungary has been in constant debates with the EU over the rule of law. Hungary has cultivated close ties with Russia and hasn't abandoned its friendliness towards Russia after Russia invaded Ukraine, which has attracted a lot of criticism. And we have Viktor Orban's party, Fidesz, which very much is an ethno-nationalist party. We can call it a populist, right-wing populist party, but then there are subtle differences compared to right-wing populist parties in Western Europe. But it's definitely EU skeptic, and it's definitely strongly against migration. So in these two aspects, it is similar to right-wing populist parties in Western Europe. Slightly differently, however, Fidesz strongly proclaims itself to be a Christian party. Now, what this actually means in practice is not necessarily clear, and there are some contradictions, but definitely the way Fidesz defines Christianity is in a relatively non-universalistic, nationalist way, and very often in a highly conservative or archaic way even. If you read Orban's rhetoric, he very often talks about how Hungary's Christian identity is endangered by various transnational threats. These include non-Christian, mainly Muslim migration to Europe. And this is by Orban very often portrayed as a deliberate plot to dilute not only Hungary, but entire Europe's supposed Christian identity. We hear some of these tropes with other populist right-wing parties as well. Orban cites other threats as well to Hungary's Christian identity. These include liberal and progressive values. They include civil society. They include the LGBTQ community, for example. So if you listen to Orban, it seems like that Christianity in Hungary is under siege. So how did Hungary, or the Hungarian government to be more precise, discover Christian persecution, which has kind of emerged as a focus point for its rhetoric and foreign policy? So the roots of this go back to the 2015 European refugee crisis. Following the crisis and during the crisis, Hungary tried to close its borders. It built a fence along the country's southern border. It refused to take part in the EU's refugee redistribution scheme. The government targeted civil society, which advocated for supporting refugees and other vulnerable groups. So basically it was creating a hostile environment to deter refugees, mainly focusing on law enforcement and border control measures, inadequate funding to refugee reception centers, etc. But there was also recognition among the government that they need to show at least some effort in addressing the root causes of migration and displacement. So this was one driver. The second driver, and this is highly anecdotal, in 2016, Orban attended a conference of the International Catholic Legislators Network. This is a relatively conservative and secretive grouping. Participation is by invitation only to like-minded lawmakers. And the goal of the group is to promote the integration of Catholic values into governance and lawmaking. So we have some anecdotal evidence of who's attending these conferences. Various members, senior members of Donald Trump's advisory team have been present at conferences like this. We know that Giorgia Meloni from Italy was present at least one of these. And you know that Orban has actually been present at least 3 ICLN conferences. So the first time he attended was in 2016, and apparently there were Christian leaders present at the conference from the Middle East. And if you believe the accounts, Orban was moved by the plight of these communities, Christian communities in the Middle East, that he decided that Hungary would stand up against the persecution of Christians. So shortly thereafter, after this conference, a new aid program was launched with the slightly paternalistically sounding name of Hungary Helps. So this program explicitly aims to support Christian communities in the global south, who, according to the government narrative, are heavily persecuted. And this is an important part of the narrative. The West ignores this persecution or downplays it, all in the name of political correctness. The government also claims that by supporting these persecuted Christian communities, it's also trying to reduce migration to Europe. I'll get back to the logic around this shortly. So Hungary Helps was launched in 2016. What has happened with the program since? It has been significantly expanded. The government has put quite a lot of resources into the Hungary Helps program, and it has become the main component of Hungary's foreign aid spending. And while you don't think of Hungary as being a superpower when it comes to foreign aid, actually Hungary's foreign aid spending and bilateral foreign aid spending has gone up by so much in these past 6-7 years that Hungary is now the largest bilateral donor of foreign aid among the 13 countries which joined the EU since 2004. So Hungary spends bilaterally more on foreign aid than Poland does, for example, even though Poland has a population 4 times the size of Hungary's. Hungary Helps initiatives. They support the reconstruction of churches, community institutions, hospitals, homes. They support business initiatives, mostly in the Middle East, but also in parts of Africa, especially the Sahel. And the only requirement is that the beneficiaries who get the funding have to be Christian community organizations or churches, faith-based institutions. According to the government's claims, aid from Hungary Helps has supported around 100,000 people to stay in their country of birth. These are unverified numbers, so we don't really know whether it's true or not. But this has definitely helped cement Hungary as an actor in religious diplomacy, and there were various other initiatives complementing the Hungary Helps program. So the Hungary Helps program was kind of the flagship of this religious diplomacy. But the government has also been organizing annual conferences around Christian persecution and sponsoring reports on the topic. So there is other activity as well. Some have seen this approach to supporting persecuted Christians as something that could be or should be emulated. So, for example, the Hungary Helps program was advertised heavily in the United States during the Trump administration, and it seems to have fallen on relatively fertile ground. So US officials acknowledged that Hungary Helps was a source of inspiration for a USAID program, which aimed to support Christian communities recovering from attacks and genocide in Iraq. And the Hungarian government specifically even signed a memorandum of understanding with USAID so that they work together in supporting Christian communities in Iraq. So this is quite interesting. That's a huge aid agency like USAID would take an interest in a relative minnow here. The program also received very significant coverage in the conservative US media. Tucker Carlson, who was back in the day still at Fox News, was a huge fan of it, and it featured on his shows relatively frequently. And the Hungary Helps program and Hungary's actions on to support persecuted Christians were even mentioned by Donald Trump when he met with Orban in the White House in 2019. So things have now obviously changed with American politics and with the Biden administration, which has very frosty relations now with Hungary. But the return of Trump is a relatively real prospect, and Orban is very much counting on it. So coming to the end of my session here, I'd just like to highlight some of the controversies and some of the problems associated with what Hungary's doing. So obviously a lot of what I've said, you can probably judge that it is slightly controversial. Hungary Helps basically discriminates recipients based on their religion, which is highly problematic. During the course of researching this, we've spoken with several officials, we've spoken with several civil society organizations as well, and some recipient communities as well. And we were trying to understand what this means in practice. Now, the Hungarian government officials retort that there is actually no discrimination. They say that it is true that only Christian organizations can get funding, but these organizations then in turn provide services to all, especially in Muslim majority countries, where the majority Muslim population is usually not excluded from receiving services provided by Christian hospitals or sending their children to Christian schools. So the government argues that actually what the support it gives reaches the majority population as well. Now, there is some literature on this that supports this claim in general, but whether it's true or not, specifically in case of the religious actors that the Hungarian government is financing, well, that's pretty much anyone's guess, because there's hardly any hard numbers or data on this. And a further interesting controversy here is that Hungary Helps is very selective, and it's only offered to certain countries, and it ignores the persecution of Christian in some other countries. So there are huge issues around the persecution of Christians in China or of non-Orthodox Christians in Russia, for example, or states like Turkey, Egypt, Azerbaijan, or former Soviet states. Some of them are also sources of migrants. Hungary does not raise the issue of Christian persecution in case of these countries. It's mainly Syria, Iraq, and other conflict-affected countries where Christian persecution seems to be an issue with Hungary. And if you look at these countries that I just mentioned, these are the countries, especially places like Russia, but also Turkey and Egypt, with which Hungary is cultivating very close political ties. So it seems that other political interests are more important for the government here than the plight of Christians. Hungary is very much against any kind of migration, so there's no protection for persecuted Christians through asylum law. If a community receives support from the Hungary Helps program, it pretty much informally at least has to try and make sure that its members do not want to migrate, or at least not migrate to Hungary. So Hungary does not give more favorable treatment for Christian refugees through its asylum practices, which is actually an interesting interesting thing, because there wouldn't the number of Christians from the Middle East who would ask for asylum in Hungary and Europe, their numbers are not huge. And supposedly, if they are Christians, then it shouldn't cause a problem with identity, as according to the Hungarian government, Muslim migrants would. Yet there's no support for Christian migration. A frequent mantra that we heard from government officials is that we need to take the help where the problems are and not import the problems to Europe. This is what they say when we ask them why don't they support the migration or asylum for Christians. The whole policy doesn't seem to be about freedom of belief, or sometimes not even about supporting persecuted Christians, but it's about signaling Hungary's intentions towards like-minded groups. And these can be the American evangelical right, it can be the Republican Party in the US, it can be the integrationist Catholics in Europe who take part in networks like the International Catholic Lawmakers Legislators Network, or it could even be Pope Francis, who has expressed concern about Christian persecution on several occasions. And finally, there's the question of domestic policy. How does this resonate with Hungarians? As opposed to some other countries in the region like Poland, Hungarians aren't really religious. About only 15% of the population says that they go attend church service regularly. So that's a relatively low share. But there are indications, and there are some surveys that say that emphasizing persecution kind of resonates with Hungary's collective memory of its own trauma. I won't go into details on Hungarian history here, but there are collective memories in Hungary about being oppressed, being persecuted, and so using this terminology does garner support with the Hungarian public. So there might be this domestic political thinking behind it, that Hungary stands up to persecution. So this is the program and Hungary's so-called FoRB policy in a nutshell, and I'm happy to discuss further and answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a really insightful presentation. I mean, you hear a lot about the sort of playbook that certain countries use when it comes to the promotion of Christian or conservative family values, but I really hadn't appreciated the extent to which Hungary was sort of a big player, and particularly when it comes to the amount of money that has been involved. There has been another question come in, funnily enough, for Anne, but I'd rather keep the focus just on Hungary for a minute. So if there's anybody who wants to ask a question in response to the last presentation, please do put it in the Q&A, but I'm going to ask a question myself, which is, do you think kind of in the context of the kind of wider situation in Hungary at the moment, that Hungary believes it's getting a return on its investment in this area in terms of what it's hoping to achieve? And do you having just mentioned that kind of the local population perhaps are not religious, and the context that we're all living in, at the moment. Do you think that there's going to be any shifts in this policy moving forward?
Well, I think it is a good question, right, of what this investment is and where the government is looking for returns. And my argument is that the government is looking for returns in terms of political influence with the countries and the groups that it sees as like-minded actors. Like I said, Orban is very much counting on Donald Trump's return. He's relatively new to Twitter, Orban, and one of his very first tweets when he came to Twitter, when he started tweeting, was, "Where is the real Donald Trump from Twitter, who was banned for some time from Twitter?" So he's very much counting on his return. And when Trump became president, Orban was very happy. He saw it as a vindication of his worldview. And then he wasn't invited to Trump's inauguration. Hungary wasn't on Trump's radar. He might not even have known that a country like Hungary exists. And so things like the Hungary Helps program were instrumentally used to build a relation with some of these voter groups that backed Trump. And then a lot of money was poured into this influence campaign in the US. And in the end, it paid off, as Orban was welcomed in the White House. This was kind of, some say that it was kind of an obsession for him to get an invitation to the White House and meet Trump there. So in this sense, the investment definitely paid off. And if you look at funding for the program, it was pretty significantly cut back after Trump lost power. Now, I'm not saying that it's because of the Biden administration and a less need to cultivate ties there. It also coincided with the pandemic, and Hungary's in pretty significant budgetary troubles at the moment. So what do you cut back on? Do you cut back on healthcare, or do you cut back on foreign aid? It's probably a no-brainer for most governments seeking to retain their support. But we'll see what happens if Trump comes back to power, or hopefully we won't see. I don't know.
Yeah, I won't ask any more kind of crystal ball predictions at this point, but let's turn now to our last speaker, John. It'd be great to hear from you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Anne and Balázs, also for your presentations. So FoRB 18 provides truthful, original, detailed and accurate monitoring and analyses of the major and significant violations of freedom of thought, conscience and belief in Central Asia, Russia, Russian-occupied Ukraine, government-held Ukraine, the South Caucasus, particularly Azerbaijan, and Belarus. In this discussion, I'll be giving a roughly 15-minute snapshot of the essential starting point for promoting freedom of original belief, or FoRB for short. Understand what the freedom is and what type of violations happen. To illustrate this, I'll look at some typical FoRB violations FoRB 18 has documented, but without looking at either all types of violations or all the territories we monitor. Understandings of freedom of original belief can be confused. Some, including two former foreign secretaries, have used the phrase freedom of religious belief, which does not exist in international human rights standards, such as the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. So it's worthwhile just giving one or two pointers to what it is. FoRB is a freedom for all people, including women, LGBTI people, atheists and agnostics. Naming particular kinds of discrimination, for example against women, can be helpful, especially in the patriarchal societies where many human rights violations happen. But it is mistaken to only consider FoRB violations against single groups only, for example Christians, as nobody and no group lives in a kind of hermetically sealed box isolated from all of society. Similarly, limiting a focus to minorities can ignore groups we had not thought of, or those who self-identify as part of majorities but may act differently, for example by following their beliefs outside of state-controlled groups. As former UN Special Rapporteur on FoRB Asma Jahangir, Pakistani lawyer who defended Christians accused of blasphemy, commented, "When I am asked which community is persecuted most, I always reply, human beings." The perpetrator's or target's beliefs may be the motivation for FoRB violations, but they may not be. Former UN Special Rapporteur and FoRB Heine Bielefeld wrote that FoRB is linked to, quotes, other freedoms, including freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly and association. There can be no free religious community life without respect for those other freedoms, which are closely intertwined with the right to freedom of religion or belief itself. This is exactly what worries authoritarian governments and often causes them to curb freedom of religion or belief. In such states, for example, Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, other serious human rights violations include denying the right to have free and fair elections, and there are also very high levels of corruption. It is a capital mistake to theorize before you have all the evidence. It biases the judgment, Sherlock Holmes is said to have told Dr. Watson. Holmes might well have been speaking about responding to FoRB violations, as evidence-based, truthful, original, detailed, and accurate monitoring and analyses of FoRB violations is the essential first step for formulating, implementing, and evaluating any realistic policies and actions seeking to end violations of FoRB and interlinked human rights. In other words, if you want to solve a problem, you first need to know what it is. This is a point stressed in both the EU guidelines on the promotion and protection of freedom of religion or belief and the British FCDO's Freedom of Religion and Belief Toolkit. The dictatorships in the territories FoRB 18 monitors are hostile to documenting reality. They target anyone they see as actually or potentially outside of their control, often claiming security, extremism, or terrorism to justify violating FoRB and other freedoms. So it is vital to ask what exactly regime claims mean in concrete reality. For as human rights defender Václav Havel commented, because the regime is captive to its own lies, it must falsify everything, observing that it is a world of appearances trying to pass for reality. Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and in the past Russia, for example, have all hosted meetings for foreign religious leaders which make extravagant claims of religious tolerance or state-controlled religious dialogue. Such meetings and their foreign guests promote state propaganda and never seriously address the hoped serious FoRB and interlinked human rights violations. This idiotic junketing, as a Western ambassador to Kazakhstan described it to me, by foreign religious leaders is dangerous. It tells such regimes that human rights, the rule of law, and freedom are of no importance. For example, Kazakhstan's commitment to tolerance and dialogue may be judged by, among many other things, the unelected President Tokayev's order in January 2022 to shoot to kill protesters without warning. He described protesters as terrorists, although the evidence points to the protests being triggered by deep frustration at the inequality, human rights violations, and the corruption the unelected regime is based upon. At least 238 people were killed. The Kazakhstan International Bureau for Human Rights and the Rule of Law found that the dead included random passers-by, children, and peaceful protesters. Around 10,000 were detained, and a KIBHR survey found that 70% of the sample they used were tortured. Torture victims included children, persons with disabilities, civil activists, and foreign nationals. Unsurprisingly, there was no discussion of this or the regime's serious FoRB violations at the regime-controlled September 2022 Congress of Leaders of World Traditional Religious World or Traditional Religions. Indeed, a Church of England bishop described herself as honoured to be present and read out the regime-drafted final declaration, which among other things stated, "We thank the Republic of Kazakhstan and President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev for convening the Congress, for their humanitarian initiatives, and for their contribution to renewal and progress, peace and harmony. In Kazakhstan, all exercise of FoRB without state permission, including sharing beliefs, is illegal. And even communities that have state permission to exist also need permission for where they hold their weekly meetings for worship. There were in 22, for example, over 140 known prosecutions for hosting worship meetings, sharing or selling religious leaders and religious literature and items, sharing or teaching faith, posting religious material online, or praying in mosques in ways that the state-controlled Muslim board bans, such as by using the word Amen. 2 ethnic Dungan Muslims who taught the Quran and Islam to local children were among those punished for teaching their faith without state permission. Although 13 Dungans have been punished for this since August 2018, police have claimed to Forum 18 that there is, quote, no ethnic factor in the prosecutions. The regime also jails Muslims for following and discussing Islam outside state-controlled structures. There are currently 10 known prisoners of conscience jailed for exercising FoRB, all Muslim men. In the most recent known jailing, on 20th of June 2022, Anatoly Zernachenko was jailed for 7 years for posting on social media Muslim texts which prosecutors claimed, without any evidence, promoted terrorism. The judge allowed no questioning of the regime's experts, and the investigator and the prosecutors refused to discuss the case with Forum 18. Many of these prisoners of conscience have been tortured. In one example, prisoner of conscience Dadesh Marjanov was tortured for marking Eid al-Fitr and praying the namaz. An official insisted to Forum 18 that he hit his head on a wall, and the Labour camp official head insisted that there aren't any tortures here. Before Russia's renewed 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the most serious FoRB violations in Russia within its internationally recognized boundaries were criminal prosecutions and jailings of banned, allegedly extremist Jehovah's Witnesses and Muslims who meet to study the works of theologian Said Nursi. In 2022, there were 124 such convictions of Jehovah's Witnesses, 48 being jailed for up to 8 years. The activities being prosecuted are meeting in homes to pray and sing together, study sacred texts, and to discuss shared beliefs. For example, on 13th March this year, Kunar Agaev and Adar Sagaev were jailed for 2 years and 6 months each for meeting other Muslims to read Nursi's works. Agaev testified that he had read Nursi's books to understand the Quran and to strengthen his faith. Books by and about Said Nursi seized in the case were ordered destroyed as they were, quotes, used as the means of the commission of a crime. No official in Moscow or Tatarstan, where the case took place, has answered Forum 18's questions about why the men were considered dangerous, who had been harmed by their actions, and why jail sentences were sought. Typically, the first those targeted know of a case against them is early morning raids on their homes by large numbers of armed FSB security service officers, Oman riot police, and possibly officers of other Russian agencies, including in one case, the investigative department of the Russian Navy's Northern Fleet. Officials search homes, seizing any religious literature, electronic devices, and money, before taking some people away for interrogation. Almost everyone investigated is, even if no trial ever happens, put on the Rosfin monitoring list of terrorists and extremists, which blocks their bank accounts and causes problems in finding formal employment, obtaining insurance, buying and selling property, and a range of other financial activities. After the renewed Russian 2022 invasion of Ukraine, new legal offences were brought in for protesting against the war, with a range of punishments of up to 10-year jail terms. Many Russian religious leaders, most prominently the Moscow Patriarchate hierarchy, support the renewed invasion. In some cases, This is due to warnings to senior and local religious leaders and prosecuting or fining religious believers and clergy who have publicly opposed the war. Similar tactics are used against the thousands of Russians who oppose the war for any reason. A small number of these protesters have protested from a religious perspective. For example, on 30th March this year, 63-year-old Orthodox Christian Mikhail Simonov was jailed for 7 years, the first jail term imposed for religious-based opposition to the war. He was accused of disseminating, quotes, false information on the basis of, quotes, political hatred, because he made 2 social media posts condemning Russian attacks on Kiev and Mariupol. He wrote, "Killing children and women. On TV we sing songs. We, Russia, have become godless. Forgive us, Lord." Officials have not answered Forum 18's questions about why they sought a long jail term for Simonov, who suffers from health problems. The renewed 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine was preceded by the 24 invasion and illegal annexation of the Ukrainian part of the Crimean Peninsula, when Russian-backed forces also seized some parts of Ukraine's Donbas province. Serious systematic of many human rights followed, including raids, fines, religious literature seizures, official surveillance, expulsions of invited foreign religious leaders, and unilateral cancellation of property contracts. More recently, in Russian-occupied Ukraine, on 27th of February this year, 3 Jehovah's Witnesses were jailed for more than 6 years each. Alexander Dubovenko, now 49, and Alexander Litvinyuk, now 62, were also banned for 5 years after their labor camp terms from educational activity, speaking publicly, and publishing anything physically or online. Also on 27th of February, in a separate trial, Taras Kuzio and Sergei Yulin and Pyotr Zhiltsov were jailed for more than 6 years each. In other Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine, Russian officials and soldiers have seized many religious leaders of a variety of religious communities. In most cases, it is unclear if they were targeted specifically for their exercise of FoRB or because they are independent Ukrainian community leaders. It is also unclear if they are still alive. On 22nd of November last year, the Russian military seized businessman and Pentecostal deacon, 52-year-old Anatoly Prokopchuk, and his 19-year-old Alexander, who lived in Novaya Kakhovka in Kherson region. On 26th of November, their shot and mutilated bodies were found in a nearby wood. They were buried 3 days later on the 29th. The Russian Kherson Region Anti-Terrorism Center refused to answer Forum 18's questions about the case, and the Russian Novaya Kakhovka police have avoided answering such questions. In no territory that Forum 18 monitors is it possible to present a complete picture of all the FoRB or other human rights violations that happen, as people and religious communities have an entirely reasonable and well-justified fear of state reprisals if they discuss their experiences. That is in itself a strong indication of the seriousness of the situation. The International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights states that recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, and that these rights derive from the inherent dignity of the human person. Current events remind us of these truths rather forcibly. Now, working out in concrete terms what practically can and should be done to defend the dignity of the human person is not easy, but this is the challenge and the opportunity which FoRB lays before us. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, John. That was a really sobering presentation, but a real sort of tour de force in terms of the amount of information, and really underscored for me, the incredible value of the work that Forum 18 is doing in monitoring and documenting these many violations in places where it's very, the context is very difficult to work in. So, a huge credit to you and your colleagues who are doing that work. I think the most striking thing from listening to your presentation is how these violations are happening in contexts where there is a real absence of the rule of law and a lack of respect for proper judicial processes and human rights and what have you. Not to be too negative, but what scope do you see within some of the countries that you're working in to have improvements in this area? At the same time that these kind of wider issues are happening? Are there openings for these kind of things to move forward, or are we looking at a very kind of bleak picture here that there's a lot of wider context that needs to happen before we can see improvements when it comes to these types of violations?
It's difficult to say. Crystal ball gazing is notoriously unreliable.
Yeah.
But I would argue that repression is in itself a sign of failure.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the most closed societies, there are people who, even though they know the consequences could be very serious indeed, refuse to toe the line. There is something in humanity, and this we find in people and of all beliefs done. I include secular human rights defenders in that, including human rights defenders who would express a religious belief, that refuses to say yes to repression and refuses to go along. That is, I would suggest, where the hope lies, as you find people expressing, the need for the rule of law, for anti-corruption, the need for respect for human rights, and so on. One point of encouragement I always find is also that if you had time traveled somebody from say 1985 to 1995 within South Africa, or indeed most of many of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, including the Soviet Union, and ask them, so what happened? Immediate time travel. They might have concluded, in the case of South Africa, that there had been a bloody conflict which the apartheid regime had lost, or indeed that there had been World War III, which the Soviet Union had lost. The reality, we know, was very, very different. Nobody predicted the, broadly speaking, peaceful changes that happened, the way in which, democracy, the rule of law, human rights came to pass in those states. We know very well that, it's not a rosy and they all lived happily ever after story or something. There are many challenges in these states, and that includes democratic states, within the EU, that sort of thing. It's, I think, not insignificant to Balazs's presentation that Hungary has regularly been found to be the most corrupt country in the EU, which I would say suggests an interesting take on their view of what Christianity is or something. But my point is this: the oppressors want us to give up hope. There is enough evidence from history that suggests that humanity doesn't quite work like that.
Thanks, John. It's good to have a bit of motivational optimism as well amongst all of these stories.
Well, I wouldn't say, Susan, optimism.
Wow.
I would say hope,
Okay.
which is not quite the same thing.
I guess it's optimism about human nature, which
okay, I accept that.
I took from your words there. I'm very conscious that we do have a few questions, and certainly one that came in quite early on, and I'm sure patiently waiting for a response. This is a specific question that's come in from Wilhelm Ospian. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name, but had a question about the work of the UN and UNESCO, but specifically around the preservation / destruction of religious, well, here I could read out this about the preservation of Christian Armenian Apostolic Church roots in the Arkan region in Nagorno-Karabakh, and what action should be taken against the Azerbaijan military who destroyed Armenian and Christian churches during the war. Now, this is the conflict that happened, and of course there are still ongoing issues there. I don't know, John, you mentioned that Azerbaijan was one of the countries that Forum 18 had been monitoring. I'm not sure if this is an area that you want to step in or speak more generally around the work of the UN and UNESCO when it comes to this.
Okay, very briefly, Forum 18 monitors violations themselves, not the responses of others to those violations. So I will pass on the subject of UNESCO, I'll pass on the subject of UN agencies. But I will also point out that we are looking here at breaches of international law in which cases can be brought. There's also, of course, the continuing blockade of the Dadevank monastery, which is carried on since 2020-21, when communication in Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia has been intercepted by the Azeri military. All one can do is keep raising the issues and be exploring the avenues that exist. It's always, while speaking on what's going on, it's also worthwhile keeping the focus on broader human rights violations. No violation takes place entirely in isolation. And so to take individual particular cases and to ignore others, well, it probably doesn't take you in a very good way, and it certainly ignores the broader context.
Okay. I don't know, Anne and Balash, if you have any comment about international responses, like from the UN or UNESCO, not specifically in this case, but in any other context.
Not on this specific case. I mean, I think what is really helpful is that there is the International Rapporteur on Religious Freedom, who have all of them, or at least starting with Heiner Bielefeld, have made really, really interesting contributions on intersections of FoRB with different other parts of human rights. So this does not answer that question at all, but if you're interested in particularly the arguments that we are putting here forward, that FoRB should be seen in the context of broader framework of human rights, they have made really interesting contributions. So it would be really interesting to have a look into their reports. But no, not on this specific case, sorry.
Okay, just conscious of time, I think I'll come back to you immediately, Anne, because there was a question specifically for you regarding the grounds for acquittal in the case against Asia Bibi. Did the reasoning behind the acquittal reflect the recognition by the courts of FoRB?
No, it didn't. It neither really recognized FoRB nor it criticized the blasphemy laws. I wouldn't necessarily say that the judges probably have their own opinion. I don't know what it is, but it is just extremely dangerous to criticize the blasphemy laws in the country, as we have seen with the assassinations and a lot of vigilant killings. So they were probably wise not to use that, but rather put their verdict more in kind of a religious framing. But the main argument was that there was a lack of evidence, and there was. And this is why she was acquitted. And basically, the local court should have acquitted her already. But as it was explained to me by local human rights activists, it's really difficult for local judges to acquit people accused of blasphemy because they are not as protected as a Supreme Court judge. Okay. So they often almost automatically give a death sentence rather than acquit people, and then hope that the case goes through their different courts what usually happens. So in general, on average, it's 5 to 8 years these cases need, and then they are acquitted. So none of those accused of blasphemy has been executed yet by the state.
Okay. There's been another question regarding a sort of different area. So the comment here saying there's a lot of religious intolerance in Saudi Arabia and Gulf states against religious minorities, including Shia, Christians, and Hindus. Now, I think the question is maybe around the level of FoRB research on these countries, and how these regimes export forms of Wahhabi Salafism to countries all over North Africa. So not sure if this is an area that you are aware of research that has already been happening or ongoing, or can point to anyone, but perhaps there is somebody who's out there already doing that. So it looks like
there is. So I don't think there's a lot of academic research, and that might be one of the reasons. Might be that doing field research on these topics in some countries is extremely dangerous and difficult. But there are human rights organizations and also states, for example, the U.S. Department of State report on religious freedom, which always also covers Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
And the Gulf states.
Before we turn, there's a more theoretical question in the chat. Does the conception of human dignity itself turn on a religious belief in the worth of the human individual? I don't know if any of you want to respond on that thought.
I'll have a go at that one, if I may. Famously, the French Catholic theologian Jacques Maritain was asked by UNESCO, when in the drafting procedures of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whether there was a shared common belief that could be used to underpin, underpin what became the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from a vast range of beliefs and others. Maritain went away, consulted a wide range of people, and the executive summary of his reply is, "We know what the rights are, just don't ask us why we believe it so." In other words, there are a vast range of religious and philosophical beliefs which can underpin the notion of human dignity. It's not one that is unique to just one. And of course, practically, human rights defenders, people who take active interest, come from a very broad range of religions and beliefs, including non-religious beliefs, which to me at least would suggest that actually there's something pretty powerful within their conception of what humanity is and what the world should be, which brings them to take such action.
Thanks, John. We've had another question come in from Helen Dudden, who says, 20 years intolerance towards the Jewish community, presumably witnessing it. I don't personally feel this will ever end. What does the panel feel? I don't know, John, if you want to take it. You've been. I mean, I'm guessing more broadly, like, and perhaps this turns more back to like, what are the positive actions we can take?
I can't answer that, to say crystal ball things. To speak very personally for a moment, my father's Second World War ended with him helping liberate a concentration camp, which left him with a profound opposition to racism of all kinds. It also, incidentally, led to him being absolutely delighted and seeing the EU as a wonderful success story when he realized, if I came back from university, that one of my best friends was German or something. I can't answer the question as to when or if it ends. All one can say is that there are enough people around the world who continue to be sufficiently concerned about anti-Semitism, about issues of discrimination, intolerance, human rights violations, to suggest that the perpetrators of such horrors and evils are not going to get away with it, and that at some point actions will be taken against it. I don't know whether that's an answer, but that will be my response.
I think it's a challenging question to answer, but I think that was a great one. And Balázs, I don't know if you have any comments generally, or perhaps it's useful just in these final moments to switch perhaps, thinking back to the fact that the Ministerial Conference happened a year ago. There was a lot of talk kind of in this presentation about the importance of intersectionality, for example, and that wasn't included in the Ministerial Conference. I don't have any thoughts kind of after this discussion, what's the direction that we should be looking at? We want to see positive steps moving forward. What should we be kind of looking for states to do, and what recommendations would you kind of put forward in that regard? I don't know who wants to ask me about.
Well, you mentioned my name, but I'm not really the best person to give an informed judgment on this. My field is development aid, and that's how I came into this whole topic. So FoRB is a relatively newish thing for me. So I think there are better qualified experts in this panel to form a judgment on what's the way forward than I am. Sorry.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yes, that probably is a question more for me. I think we have made progress because governments start to talk about it now, right? So they start to understand that, first of all, as John emphasized at the beginning so correctly, FoRB is not only for white men, not white men, but not only for men, it's for women, it's for people from the LGBTI community, it is for people with disabilities. So I think that is something that governments start to understand, that we have to look at different groups and that FoRB needs to be protected for all different groups. And I think that's a good thing. But I think we have to go a step further and really look at how FoRB intersects in specific cases with other forms of human rights violations. And again, John gave some really good examples of how much overlap there is with a violation of freedom of expression, with a violation of freedom from torture, from cruel and inhuman treatment, etc. And I think that needs to be. These considerations need to be mainstreamed into foreign policies, and when strategies are developed for specific cases. And I think that's not really happening yet. So there's more talk about it, but I think if you look at the practical policies, there still is quite some disconnect, with some exceptions. I'm not saying nobody does anything, but I think there really is hope. But the other thing is, I think we need to encourage other groups, and I'm coming from the women's rights perspective. For example, most women's rights organizations are very disconnected from policies for FoRB because for different reasons. There may be many may still see religion as kind of clashing with gender equality and women's rights. There might be different reasons, but I think it's really important to encourage activists and human rights groups from different areas to come together and speak about human rights, but also include FoRB into these considerations.
Kind of, I was going to call back to your earlier points actually about understanding the problem and wonder whether, when actually talking about international aid and helping and making policies domestically in our own countries, we're not having these conversations maybe as much as we should have, and understanding these rights. But sorry, I was cutting across you, John, but to actually invite you to speak.
I was just going to say that exactly what Anne has just said about the need for women's rights activists to talk together is a key concern of the current Special Rapporteur, Ernest for Nazira Ghane. So that is something she would be very, very interested in having, and to become on the domestic thing. Well, she's in Oxford, and that's fairly domestic to this context. Not quite so far afield as Birmingham, but heading there. I agree completely with what Anne says about the need to encourage connection and discussion about human rights and approaches that are human rights based. as with the basic understanding that all human beings should be able to exercise all human rights.
Mm.
That's it.
Yeah, well, there's a last question that's come in, which I think is kind of interesting, particularly with regards to awareness, from Richard Rogers. In Soviet times, there was apparently a lot of awareness in the West, including in churches, of rights violations in Russia. Is there more or less detailed awareness today of cases and individual prisoners, or are people less aware and perhaps, overwhelmed by recent political developments? Is it a problem of awareness, in fact, or there are other things that we need to consider? The wider context of understanding the issue as a whole.
Well, I'm probably the wrong person to ask, because I'm quite aware of that. That's because I work on it. Something. I would suggest everybody present in this discussion could answer that one for themselves as to whether or not they're more or less aware around such questions. FoRB 18, UNIST of other places also has plenty of information on this. But as we know, we live in a world where there are a vast number of other issues competing for attention.
Indeed.
I don't know whether Anne or Balazs, whether you would also want to chip in on that, as well as you, Susan, around human rights for Russia and indeed more generally.
I think it's very hard to judge, and sometimes it's an incredibly subjective view, particularly if you work in a particular space. You could argue that we are so much more connected to people, especially visually, in a way that we weren't before, when things were just being reported in newspapers from faraway places. But how that kind of relates into impact and how people are then sort of focused on that issue, wanting to contribute on that issue, it's very hard, I believe, to say. But just coming into the final couple of minutes, I don't know, Anne and Balazs, if you wanted to add any final thoughts as to what you hope people would kind of take away from this discussion and steps moving forward. Maybe, yeah, Anne first.
Shall I start? I actually also have a question to Balazs. Can I ask that first?
Please go ahead.
And then he can kind of run up. I would be interested, because what we often see is that kind of this hijacking of FoRB by a right-wing agenda often deters others to be supportive of FoRB. So how's the situation in Hungary? How do other political parties and supporters of other political parties than Fidesz see these programs and agenda? Is there kind of a still support for this human right, or has it actually a quite counterproductive effect on how people think about that?
Well, this was kind of what I was thinking about, reflecting on here in the end, about how these right-wing groups hijack FoRB, or maybe that would have used a different terminology, that they instrumentalize it for other political purposes. And I think this is definitely something to take care of. And we see this in the United States with the evangelicals who when talking about FoRB, they either talk about FoRB for Christians, or they're also very sympathetic to Israel and the Jewish community. So it's just these two groups who can have FoRB and no one else. But coming back to, there's no opposition really in Hungary, so it's difficult to say what they think about it. When they talk about the policy, they attack the government for spending money on communities far away instead of spending it on hospitals or schools in Hungary, which is a fairly populist argument of its own. But there isn't really a discourse about FoRB itself more broadly, so it's difficult to see whether this has hurt it or not. So this whole discourse that we get from the government that Hungary is a Christian country and it needs to look out for other Christians is pretty much uncontested. Maybe there's not much societal interest in it. The opposition is too weak to talk about this, and like I said, they only use the money argument. So I don't think it's hurt for discussions because there weren't any around the topic to begin with. In this sense, maybe you could argue that Fidesz was the one who brought it up and introduced it, but it remains a rather one-sided discourse because they're setting the agenda exclusively on it.
Okay, I realize that we are slightly sort of over time. I'm going to just do a very last kind of shout out to the panelists if they want to add anything at this final stage, but it's been a great discussion, a very wide-ranging discussion. I feel better informed on this topic, and I hope the audience do too. But any final words from you, Anne or John?
Just very briefly, as I said earlier, I think we need to mainstream an intersectional perspective, and we need to listen to local actors, what they want and what they think are the most important strategies in specific cases. That would be my main recommendations.
Thanks. And John?
We should, I think, remind ourselves that large groups of human beings routinely have different opinions from each other. That's quite normal. So I think when we hear people claiming to speak in the name of all Christians or evangelicals or whatever, we should problematize that. I can certainly think of plenty of evangelicals who are friends of mine who will be highly opposed to the likes of Trump and so forth. I've heard them arguing for rights for LGBTI people, initiative for Muslims and so on. I think we should remember that it is basically violators of human rights who want to persuade us that they speak for all people. So if we think there is a problem, we need to speak out, and we need to say it and say, well, hold it, I'm a whatever group it happens to be, and I don't agree with something, you know, for reasons based on my particular beliefs, whether they be religious or non-religious. So I think it's important to avoid that kind of discourse and to come back to the fact that if all human beings should have all human rights, that gives all human beings a very, very good reason indeed for speaking out for all human rights.
I mean, I think that's a brilliant note to end it on. I couldn't agree more. So thank you very much to our speakers, John and Balázs, and a huge thanks to those who've attended and engaged with your questions online. And I think we'll leave it there for this evening, although I'm sure the conversations will continue on this topic going forward. So thank you again, and good evening.
Thank you for chairing us, Susan, also.
Yes,
Thank you for the excellent sharing. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.